Dearest listeners, one must confess that in all my years observing the peculiar machinations of London society, few tales have delighted me quite as much as the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Miss Genevieve Thornberry's most unconventional path to love. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most scandalous tale of an heiress who discovered that sometimes, to find one's true worth, one must first abandon all pretense of it. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Thornberry House in Grosvenor Square as Miss Genevieve Thornberry stood before her looking-glass, regarding her reflection with an expression that could only be described as mutinous. At 22, she possessed the sort of beauty that poets might describe as ethereal. Golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, eyes the color of summer sky, and features so delicately formed that one might suspect nature of showing favoritism. Yet on this particular morning in late April, as the season reached its zenith, those lovely features were marred by a frown of considerable depth. The source of her discontent lay not in her appearance, which even her harshest critics could find no fault with, but rather in the letter that rested upon her escritoire, its contents having been delivered by her father just the evening prior. Lord Thornberry, a man of considerable wealth whose fortune had been made in the Indies trade, had arranged what he considered to be a most advantageous match with the Marquis of Whitehall, a gentleman of impeccable lineage whose estates in Yorkshire were said to rival those of the Duke of Devonshire himself. The wedding, her father had informed her with the sort of satisfaction reserved for particularly profitable business ventures, would take place before Michaelmas. The difficulty, as Genevieve saw it, was that she had met the Marquis of Whitehall precisely twice. Once at Lady Jersey's soirée, where he had spoken exclusively of his prized hunters, and once at the opera, where he had slept through the entire second act of Don Giovanni. Neither encounter had inspired the sort of romantic feelings one might hope for in a future husband. Indeed, the Marquis, though possessed of an ancient title and considerable wealth, had all the charm of a particularly dull treatise on agricultural management. Yet, to be entirely fair, his passion for his estates and agricultural pursuits was genuine, even admirable in its way. His lack of charm was, perhaps, merely brutal honesty. He made no effort to appear as anything other than what he was, a man of the land who viewed marriage as another form of estate management. As she contemplated her fate, a gentle knock came at the door, followed by the entrance of her lady's maid, Mary Fitzgerald. Mary was a girl of Irish descent, perhaps a year younger than Genevieve herself, with dark hair that she kept severely pinned beneath her cap and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. She had been in the Thornberry household for 3 years, having come to them from a respectable family fallen on hard times, and in that period had proven herself both capable and discreet. The two young women had developed, over time, an understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between mistress and servant. Perhaps it was their proximity in age, or perhaps it was Mary's quick wit and practical wisdom that had endeared her to Genevieve, but whatever the cause, they had become something approaching confidants, though always within the proper bounds of their respective stations. Mary entered, carrying the morning's post on a silver salver, her movements graceful, despite the worn nature of her simple gray dress. She paused upon seeing her mistress's expression, for she had developed an uncanny ability to read Genevieve's moods as one might read a familiar book. The conversation that followed would prove to be the catalyst for one of the most extraordinary deceptions ever attempted in polite society. Genevieve, in a moment of desperation that would have horrified her mother had she been privy to it, confessed to Mary her deepest wish: to experience, just once before her marriage, confined her forever to the role of a marchioness. What it might be like to move through the world without the weight of expectation, without the constant scrutiny of the tongue, without the suffocating propriety that dictated her every word and gesture. Mary, who possessed both a romantic heart and a practical mind, listened to her mistress's lamentations with growing sympathy. She herself had often observed the golden cage in which young ladies of quality were kept, and though she knew the alternative, the precarious life of those without means, she could understand the appeal of temporary freedom. It was Mary who first voiced the idea that would change everything, though she did so with considerable hesitation and no small amount of trepidation. The scheme they devised was audacious in its simplicity. Genevieve's parents were departing that very afternoon for a fortnight's stay at Lord Thornbury's estates in Kent, where pressing business matters required his attention. They would leave Genevieve in London under the supervision of her aged aunt, Lady Prudence Thornbury, a woman whose primary interests were her Persian cats and her afternoon naps, and who could be relied upon to pay minimal attention to her niece's activities so long as appearances were maintained. During this fortnight, Mary would assume Genevieve's identity, claiming a sudden indisposition that would confine her to her chambers. The servants, who rarely saw their young mistress except at formal occasions, would think nothing unusual of Mary attending to her supposed invalid mistress's needs. Meanwhile, Genevieve would take Mary's place, experiencing life as a lady's maid, free to move about the city with the kind of liberty that her station had never previously afforded her. The preparations for this grand deception required considerable ingenuity. Genevieve practiced adopting Mary's slight Irish lilt, though they agreed she would claim to be from Somerset should anyone inquire, to explain any inconsistencies in her accent. Mary, for her part, studied Genevieve's mannerisms, her way of holding her head, the particular gesture she made with her hand when she was thinking. They exchanged clothing, Genevieve donning Mary's simple gray dress and white cap, while Mary somewhat nervously tried on one of Genevieve's morning gowns, a creation of sprigged muslin that transformed her appearance entirely. What neither young woman could have anticipated was that Lord Thornbury, in his infinite wisdom and desire to improve his daughter's accomplishments before her marriage, had engaged a tutor to arrive that very week. Mr. Augustin Fletcher came highly recommended from Oxford, where he had distinguished himself as a scholar of considerable merit despite his humble origins. The son of a country parson, he had won his place at university through sheer brilliance and determination, and had spent the years since his graduation teaching the sons and daughters of the wealthy, saving every penny toward his dream of one day establishing his own school for gifted children of modest means. Mr. Augustin Fletcher arrived at Thornbury House on a Tuesday morning that threatened rain, the sky hanging low and grey over London's chimney pots. He was a gentleman of 28 years, possessing that particular combination of height and leanness that suggested both scholarly dedication and physical vigor. There was about him a grace uncommon to drawing rooms, the fluid movement of one who had learned rhythm from wind-bent trees and rolling hills, whose body moved with the unconscious elegance of streams finding their course rather than the calculated steps prescribed by dancing masters. His dark hair, which had a tendency to curl despite his best efforts to tame it, was slightly longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes, while clean and well-maintained, bore the subtle signs of careful mending that marked him as a gentleman of limited means. He carried with him a worn leather satchel containing the tools of his trade, volumes of poetry, philosophical treatises, and a well-thumbed copy of Shakespeare's complete works that had been his father's parting gift when he left for university. His eyes, a striking shade of green that seemed to shift between sage and emerald depending on the light, held an intensity that suggested a mind constantly at work, observing, analyzing, finding beauty and meaning in the minutiae that others overlooked. The butler who answered his knock was a man of imposing dignity named Harrington, who had served the Thornbury family for longer than anyone could quite remember. He regarded Mr. Fletcher with the kind of polite scrutiny that butlers of great houses perfect over years of service, taking in the scholar's modest appearance and finding nothing objectionable enough to warrant rudeness, but nothing impressive enough to inspire particular deference. Mr. Fletcher was shown to the morning room, where he was informed that Miss Thornbury was indisposed, but that her companion would receive him to discuss the arrangements for her lessons. He waited, studying the portraits that lined the walls, generations of Thornburys looking down with expressions of varying severity, and wondering what manner of young lady required such last-minute educational improvement. His experience with the daughters of wealthy merchants was mixed. Some possessed sharp minds eager for knowledge, while others viewed learning as merely another accomplishment to be displayed, like embroidery or watercolors. When the door opened, he turned, expecting to encounter some elderly woman of faded gentility serving as companion to the invalid Miss Thornberry. Instead, he found himself facing a young woman in servant's attire, whose presence seemed to alter the very air in the room. She was lovely, certainly, with hair the color of honey visible beneath her cap, and eyes that held depths he could not immediately fathom. But it was something beyond mere physical beauty that arrested his attention. There was an intelligence in her gaze, a barely suppressed energy in her bearing that suggested a spirit not entirely comfortable with its current constraints. Genevieve, for her part, had not expected the tutor to be young, nor had she expected him to possess the kind of quiet magnetism that made one want to lean closer, to discover what thoughts moved behind those remarkable eyes. She had pictured some dusty academic, perhaps with spectacles and a stoop, certainly with the pompous manner that she associated with those who made their living displaying their superior knowledge. Mr. Fletcher was none of these things. She remembered just in time to drop a curtsy appropriate to her supposed station. She had practiced this with Mary, but under Mr. Fletcher's steady gaze, she felt clumsy, uncertain. She spoke, careful to maintain the slight Somerset accent she had rehearsed, explaining that Miss Thornberry was suffering from a nervous complaint and would be unable to receive visitors for some days, but that she, Mary, had been instructed to assist Mr. Fletcher in preparing lessons that might be conducted once her mistress recovered. Mr. Fletcher accepted this explanation with good grace, though something in his expression suggested a mind filing away observations for future consideration. He proposed that they might use this time to review the curriculum he had prepared, so that when Miss Thornberry was well enough to begin, no time would be lost. He spoke of literature and philosophy, of history and languages, with a passion that transformed his rather austere features into something approaching handsome. They sat, with perfect propriety, on opposite sides of a small table in the library, and Mr. Fletcher began to outline his proposed course of study. He spoke of the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, Byron and Shelley, and how their work reflected the changing relationship between man and nature, between individual desire and social obligation. He discussed the philosophical underpinnings of contemporary thought, the tension between reason and emotion that characterized the age. As he spoke, Genevieve found herself leaning forward, entirely forgetting the submissive posture appropriate to a maid. She asked questions that betrayed an education far beyond what might be expected of a servant, then caught herself attempting to cover her mistake with stammered explanations about overhearing her mistress's previous tutors. Mr. Fletcher said nothing, but there was a sharpening of attention in his gaze, a subtle adjustment in his manner that suggested he had noticed the inconsistency. The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived, drumming against the library windows with increasing intensity. The sound created a sense of intimacy in the book-lined room, as if the weather had drawn a curtain between them and the outside world. Mr. Fletcher had moved from discussing the curriculum to reading aloud from Wordsworth's Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, his voice taking on a musical quality that made the familiar words seem new. Genevieve listened with her whole being, hearing in the poetry an echo of her own yearning for something beyond the narrow confines of her prescribed life. When he reached the lines about the still, sad music of humanity, she found herself blinking back unexpected tears, moved by both the beauty of the verse and the way he delivered it, as if each word were a gift he was placing before her. The spell was broken by the arrival of Harrington, announcing that cook required Mary's assistance with some household matter. Genevieve rose, reluctant to leave this unexpected sanctuary, and made her curtsy. As she reached the door, Mr. Fletcher called after her, his voice carrying a note of something she could not quite identify. Curiosity, perhaps, or something warmer. He suggested that since Miss Thornberry remained indisposed, perhaps Mary might continue to assist him in preparing materials for her mistress's eventual recovery. He could, he proposed, share with her the essence of each lesson, which she could then convey to Miss Thornberry in a manner appropriate to an invalid's delicate constitution. It was, he argued with perfect logic, the most efficient way to proceed. Genevieve agreed, her heart racing with a combination of guilt at the deception and exhilaration at the prospect of spending more time in Mr. Fletcher's company. As she made her way to the kitchen, she reflected on the irony of her situation. She had traded places with Mary to escape the suffocating expectations of her life, only to find herself drawn to a man who believed her to be a servant, a man who would never, under normal circumstances, have been permitted to speak to her with such easy familiarity. The following days fell into a pattern that Genevieve found both thrilling and increasingly difficult to maintain. Each morning, Mr. Fletcher would arrive precisely at 10 o'clock, and they would retire to the library where, under the guise of preparing lessons for the absent Miss Thornbury, they would lose themselves in discussions that ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the profound to the personal. Mr. Fletcher, she discovered, possessed a mind that delighted in making unexpected connections. He could begin with a discussion of Greek mythology and somehow arrive at observations about contemporary politics without the journey seeming forced or pretentious. He had opinions about everything, strong opinions, firmly held, but he was willing, eager even, to have them challenged. He seemed to find in Mary an unexpectedly capable intellectual companion, and the surprise and pleasure this gave him was evident in the way his eyes lit up when she made a particularly astute observation. For her part, Genevieve found herself revealing more of her true self than was wise. She spoke of books she could not possibly have read as a maid, referenced travels she hastily attributed to stories told by previous employers, and displayed a familiarity with French and Italian that she lamely explained as the result of serving in households where such languages were spoken. Each lie required another to support it, until she felt she was constructing an elaborate edifice that might collapse at the slightest pressure. Mr. Fletcher, if he noticed these inconsistencies, chose not to comment directly upon them. Instead, he began to bring extra books, claiming they might help Mary better understand what would be expected of her mistress. He taught her as if she were his actual student, rather than a mere intermediary. And there were moments when Genevieve forgot entirely that she was supposed to be a servant, losing herself in the joy of intellectual engagement she had never experienced in the drawing rooms of the Tun. The crisis came on the fourth day, when Lady Prudence, roused from her customary lethargy by a neighbor's gossip about a particularly shocking novel, decided to inspect her niece's reading material. She swept into the library unannounced, her 3 Persian cats trailing behind her like a feline retinue, just as Genevieve was in the midst of a passionate defense of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. The old lady stopped short at the sight of what she believed to be a servant engaged in animated discussion with the tutor, both of them surrounded by books and papers, looking for all the world like equals engaged in scholarly debate. Her expression shifted from surprise to disapproval, and she demanded to know what precisely was occurring in her brother's library. Mr. Fletcher rose immediately, his manner becoming formal and correct. He explained that he was preparing materials for Miss Thornbury's education, and that Mary was assisting by helping him understand what level of instruction would be appropriate for her mistress. It was a reasonable explanation, delivered with perfect propriety, but Lady Prudence's eyes narrowed as she looked between them, sensing something amiss, even if she could not quite identify what it was. She dismissed Genevieve with a sharp command to attend to her supposed mistress, and then turned her attention to Mr. Fletcher. Through the partially open door, Genevieve could hear her aunt's voice, shrill with indignation, reminding the tutor of the proper boundaries between the classes, of the danger of encouraging pretensions in servants who might forget their place. Mr. Fletcher's responses were too quiet to make out, but the tone suggested respectful disagreement. As Genevieve departed, she caught a glimpse of her aunt's expression, and was startled to see not anger, but rather a curious sort of satisfaction, as if Lady Prudence were watching pieces on a chessboard move exactly where she had anticipated they would. That evening, as Genevieve helped Mary practice eating soup with the proper delicacy required of a lady, a skill that proved surprisingly difficult to master, she confessed her growing attachment to Mr. Fletcher. Mary listened with a combination of sympathy and alarm, pointing out the impossibility of the situation. He believed her to be a servant, and even if the truth were revealed, he was still a penniless tutor while she was engaged to a marquis. There could be no happy ending to such a story. But Genevieve, in the grip of an emotion she had never expected to feel, could not bring herself to care about consequences. She spoke of how Mr. Fletcher's mind worked, how he could find beauty in the most unexpected places, how he treated her, or rather, who he believed her to be, with a respect and consideration that none of the supposed gentlemen of her acquaintance had ever shown. He spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered, as if her opinions had value beyond their decorative function. Mary, wise beyond her years, recognized the signs of a heart beyond recovery. She also recognized the danger, not just to Genevieve's reputation, but to Mr. Fletcher's livelihood. If he were discovered to have formed an attachment to either a servant or, worse, to a lady of quality who had deceived him, his career as a tutor would be finished. No respectable family would employ him, and his dreams of establishing his own school would be destroyed. The next morning brought a new complication. A letter arrived from Lord Thornbury, announcing his intention to return earlier than expected, bringing with him the Marquis of Whitehall, who was eager to further his acquaintance with his intended bride. They would arrive in 3 days' time, expecting to find Genevieve recovered from her indisposition and ready to receive her future husband. Panic set in at Thornbury House. The deception that had seemed so clever, so harmless, now threatened to collapse with potentially catastrophic consequences. Genevieve and Mary spent hours trying to devise a solution, a way to exchange places once more without arousing suspicion. But every scenario they imagined ended in disaster. Lord Thornbury's unexpectedly early return, a full 11 days before his planned fortnight was complete, had destroyed their carefully laid plans. It was then that Mr. Fletcher chose to complicate matters further. That afternoon, as they sat in the library with rain once again pattering against the windows, he set aside the book from which he had been reading and looked at her with an expression of such intensity that Genevieve felt her breath catch. He spoke carefully, as if each word had been weighed and measured before being released. He said that he knew she was not what she seemed, that no lady's maid, however intelligent, could possess her depth of education, her familiarity with the classics, her understanding of philosophical concepts that most gentlemen of his acquaintance could not grasp. He did not know who she truly was, he said, but he knew who she was not. The silence that followed Mr. Fletcher's declaration stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken truths and impossible desires. Genevieve sat frozen, her mind racing through possible responses, each one more inadequate than the last. The rain outside had intensified, and thunder rumbled in the distance, as if nature itself were commenting on the drama unfolding in the quiet library. Finally, Mr. Fletcher spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. He told her that he did not require her to explain her deception, that he understood there must be circumstances that necessitated such subterfuge. What he needed her to know, what honor demanded he confess, was that regardless of her true identity, regardless of the impossibility of their situations, he had developed feelings for her that went far beyond what was appropriate between a tutor and a servant, or indeed, between a tutor and anyone. He spoke of how her mind had captivated him from their first meeting, how her passionate engagement with ideas had awakened something in him that had been dormant through years of teaching indifferent students. He praised her wit, her courage, the way she challenged his assumptions and forced him to defend his positions with greater rigor than he had ever been required to employ before. He had come to Thornbury House expecting to endure another tedious engagement with a spoiled heiress, and had instead found someone who made him look forward to each day with an anticipation that was entirely new to his experience. As he spoke, he rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back to her, as if he could not bear to see her expression as he laid his heart bare. He told her that he knew he had nothing to offer, no fortune, no title, no connections of value. He was merely the son of a country parson, making his way in the world through his knowledge and his ability to impart it to others. He had no right to speak to her of feelings, no right to burden her with his regard, but with her true identity a mystery, and the strong possibility that he might never see her again once Miss Thornbury recovered from her illness. He could not let the opportunity pass without confession. Genevieve rose from her own chair, moving toward him with steps that felt predetermined, as if some force beyond her control were guiding her actions. She spoke his name, Mr. Fletcher, and he turned to face her, his green eyes dark with emotion. What happened next would have scandalized anyone observing, though in truth it was modest by any standard, save that of the strictest propriety. She took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses from years of holding a pen, the warmth that seemed to travel from his fingers directly to her heart. She told him that his feelings were reciprocated, that from the moment he had begun reading Wordsworth in his beautiful voice, she had felt something shift inside her, some recognition of a kindred spirit she had never expected to find. She could not, she said, tell him the full truth of her situation. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but she wanted him to know that the person he had come to know in these stolen hours in the library was more truly herself than she had ever been allowed to be before. The passionate opinions, the love of learning, the joy in intellectual combat, all of these were real, more real than the role she played in her everyday life. Mr. Fletcher's hand tightened on hers, and for a moment she thought he might pull her closer, might cross the line that propriety had drawn between them. But he was, at his core, an honorable man, and after a moment that stretched like eternity, he released her hand and stepped back. He spoke then of his dreams, of the school he hoped to establish, where children of talent but limited means could receive the education that would allow them to rise in the world through merit rather than birth. He had been saving for 5 years, denying himself all but the most basic necessities, and had nearly enough to purchase a small property in the countryside where he could begin with just a few students. It was not much of a future to offer anyone, he said, certainly not someone accustomed to the comforts of even a servant's position in a grand house like Thornbury House. But if she were ever free of whatever obligations bound her, if she ever found herself in a position to choose her own path, he wanted her to know that she would be welcome in his life, in whatever capacity she might choose. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the spell. They moved apart quickly, resuming their seats with books in hand, so that when Harrington entered to announce that Mr. Fletcher's time was concluded for the day, they appeared to be engaged in nothing more scandalous than literary discussion. As Mr. Fletcher gathered his belongings, he paused at the door and looked back at her. He said, with careful formality that did nothing to disguise the meaning beneath the words, that he would return tomorrow to continue preparing for Miss Thornbury's lessons, but that he understood if Mary were no longer available to assist him. The choice, he made clear, was hers. After he left, Genevieve sat alone in the library, her thoughts in turmoil. She had 3 days before her father returned with the Marquis, 3 days to make a decision that would affect not only her own future, but those of everyone involved in her deception. She thought of Mr. Fletcher's school, of the children who would benefit from his teaching, and knew that any scandal attached to his name would destroy those dreams forever. She thought of Mary, loyal Mary, who had risked her position to help her, and who would certainly be dismissed without reference if the truth were discovered. She thought of her parents, whose social standing would be devastated if it became known that their daughter had been masquerading as a servant while conducting an inappropriate relationship with a penniless tutor. That evening, she found Mary in the room they had been sharing, Genevieve's own chamber, where Mary continued to play the part of the invalid miss. Mary had been crying, and when Genevieve asked what had distressed her, she learned that Harrington, acting on Lady Prudence's instructions, had been making inquiries about the servants, particularly about any unusual behavior or circumstances surrounding Miss Thornbury's illness. The butler, Mary reported, was no fool. He had noticed discrepancies, the way Mary had been permitted liberties no servant should enjoy, the way she carried herself when she thought no one was watching, the unusual arrangements surrounding Miss Thornbury's supposed illness. He had not yet drawn the correct conclusions, but he was approaching them with the methodical determination that had made him such an excellent butler. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's storms having washed the London air clean. Genevieve woke with a sense of impending doom, knowing that this might be her last day of freedom, her last chance to see Mr. Fletcher before the elaborate deception came crashing down around them all. She dressed in Mary's simple gray dress with fingers that trembled slightly, pinning her hair beneath the white cap that had become both disguise and symbol of her temporary liberation. Mary, for her part, donned one of Genevieve's morning gowns with increasing nervousness. The strain of maintaining the charade was beginning to show on both young women. When Mr. Fletcher arrived, Genevieve noticed immediately that something had changed in his manner. He was formal, almost cold, avoiding her eyes as he arranged his materials on the library table. When she asked if something was amiss, he produced a letter from his pocket and placed it before her. It was from the Marquess of Whitehall, written in an elegant hand on paper that bore his impressive seal. The Marquess had written to Mr. Fletcher, having heard of his engagement as tutor to Miss Thornbury, to request his assistance in a delicate matter. He wished Mr. Fletcher to pay particular attention to instructing Miss Thornbury in the poets and authors he, the Marquess, particularly admired, so that they might have subjects of mutual interest to discuss during their married life. Enclosed was a list of works, all of them stupefyingly dull treatises on agricultural improvement and hunting techniques disguised as literature. The letter went on to explain that the Marquess would be arriving shortly to further his acquaintance with his bride-to-be, and that he expected Mr. Fletcher to have made significant progress in molding Miss Thornbury's mind to appreciate the subjects that would be important in her future role as Marchioness of Whitehall. Mr. Fletcher's voice was carefully neutral as he asked whether Mary had been aware that her mistress was engaged to be married. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Genevieve could not meet his eyes as she confirmed that yes, she had known of the engagement, that it had been arranged by Miss Thornbury's father and was considered highly advantageous. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet they had previously shared. This was the silence of things that could not be said, of futures that could not be shared, of hearts that had no right to beat in sympathy with one another. Mr. Fletcher began to speak of the curriculum the Marquess had requested, his tone professionally detached, and Genevieve felt something inside her chest constrict painfully. Unable to bear it, she rose abruptly, mumbling something about duties she needed to attend to. But as she reached the door, Mr. Fletcher called her back. His professional mask had slipped, and his face showed the anguish he had been trying to conceal. He asked her, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, whether Miss Thornbury was happy about her engagement, whether she welcomed the match with the Marquess, whether she had any choice in the matter at all. Genevieve turned back to face him, and in that moment, the weight of all her deception felt unbearable. She told him, with tears threatening to spill from her eyes, that Miss Thornbury had no choice, that she was as trapped by her circumstances as any prisoner in Newgate. She spoke of the golden cage that society constructed for women of fortune, how they were traded like commodities between powerful men, their own desires considered as little as those of the horses in their father's stables. Mr. Fletcher listened, his expression growing increasingly pained. When she finished, he said quietly that he had hoped, that perhaps Mary and he might have had a future together, modest though it might be. He had imagined her helping him with his school, teaching the younger children, sharing in his dream of education as a means of liberation. But now, understanding that her heart was already engaged, even if not to him, he saw that he had been foolish to hope. Genevieve wanted to cry out that he misunderstood, that her heart was entirely his, but she could not find the words that would not also reveal the full extent of her deception. Instead, she stood frozen as he gathered his things, saying that he would return tomorrow for one final session before the Marquess's arrival, but that afterward his services would no longer be required. The Marquess had made it clear in his letter that once married, his wife would have no need of further education beyond what was necessary to manage a household and provide appropriate ornament to his position. After he left, Genevieve collapsed in a chair, giving way to the tears she had been holding back. She was found there by Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, who had come to investigate why Mary was spending so much time in the library when her duties lay elsewhere. The older woman's sharp eyes took in Genevieve's tear-stained face and the scattered books on the table, and her expression hardened. That afternoon, Harrington requested an audience with Lady Prudence. What transpired in that meeting, Genevieve learned only later, but the result was swift and dramatic. Lady Prudence, accompanied by Mrs. Hughes and Harrington, swept into Genevieve's chamber where Mary was maintaining the pretense of illness. The confrontation that followed was masterful in its execution. Lady Prudence, for all her apparent indolence, possessed a sharp intelligence when roused. She had Mary rise from the bed and walk about the room, noting the uncertain way she moved in the expensive nightgown, the calluses on her hands that no lady of quality would possess. She asked pointed questions about family connections, about childhood memories, about details that only the true Genevieve would know. Mary, loyal to the last, attempted to maintain the deception, but it was hopeless. Within minutes, the truth was exposed, and Lady Prudence demanded to know where her actual niece could be found. It was then that Genevieve, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway, still dressed in Mary's gray dress and cap. The scene that greeted Genevieve as she entered her own chamber was one of controlled chaos. Lady Prudence sat in the chair by the window, her face a mask of aristocratic displeasure that did not quite hide the glimmer of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. Mary stood near the bed, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face, looking utterly miserable in Genevieve's fine nightgown. Mrs. Hughes and Harrington flanked the doorway like sentinels, their expressions carefully neutral in the way of servants who have witnessed something scandalous, but know better than to show their thoughts. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Prudence raised her lorgnette and examined her niece through it, as if seeing her for the first time. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry as autumn leaves. She remarked that in all her 67 years, through all the scandals she had witnessed in society, and there had been many, including the infamous incident involving the Duke of Worthington and the opera dancer, she had never encountered such a thoroughly harebrained scheme. She inquired, with devastating politeness, what precisely Genevieve had hoped to accomplish with this charade, beyond the complete ruination of her reputation and the destruction of her father's social standing. Genevieve, finding courage in the fact that the worst had already happened, raised her chin and met her aunt's gaze directly. She spoke with a clarity born of desperation about the suffocating nature of her existence, the way she had been prepared since childhood like a prize heifer for market, educated just enough to be ornamental but never enough to be truly accomplished, taught to smile and curtsy and play the pianoforte, but never encouraged to think or question or dream. She spoke of the Marquis of Whitehall, of how her father had sold her, yes, sold her, she used that word deliberately, to a man who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful addition to his collection of valuable objects, someone to bear his heirs and manage his household and look decorative at his dining table. She had wanted, just once, to know what it felt like to be valued for herself, not for her dowry or her beauty or her connections. Lady Prudence listened to this impassioned speech without interruption, though her expression underwent several subtle changes. When Genevieve finally fell silent, breathing hard from the intensity of her confession, her aunt turned to the servants and dismissed them with a wave of her hand. Even Mary was sent away, though Genevieve reached out to press her hand reassuringly as she passed, trying to convey that she would not let her suffer for participating in the deception. Once they were alone, Lady Prudence's manner underwent a remarkable transformation. The stern disapproval melted away, replaced by something that looked surprisingly like sympathy. She told Genevieve to sit down and stop looking like she expected to be sent to the gallows. What followed was a conversation unlike any Genevieve had ever had with her aunt. Lady Prudence spoke of her own youth, of a love affair with a young poet who had no fortune but who had made her heart sing with his words. She had been forced to give him up, to marry Lord Prudence, a good man, but one she had never loved, and had spent 40 years in a marriage that was comfortable but empty of passion. She had watched her niece, she said, preparing for the same fate, and had said nothing because that was the way of their world. Women of their class did not marry for love. They married for advantage, for connection, for the continuation of family lines and the consolidation of fortunes. But now, having witnessed the lengths to which Genevieve had gone to escape that fate, she found herself reconsidering her silence. She asked Genevieve about Mr. Fletcher. The question was so unexpected that Genevieve started, her cheeks flushing crimson. How did her aunt know about Mr. Fletcher? Lady Prudence's smile was knowing. She might appear to spend all her time with her cats, but very little escaped her notice in her brother's house. She had observed the way Mary and the tutor had looked at each other, the energy that crackled between them when they thought no one was watching. Genevieve found herself confessing everything. Her growing feelings for Mr. Fletcher, his declaration of regard, the impossibility of their situation. She spoke of his brilliance, his passion for education, his dreams of establishing a school. She described how he treated her as an equal, how he valued her thoughts and challenged her assumptions. She admitted that she loved him, truly loved him, in a way she had not believed possible. Lady Prudence listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking pointed questions. What were Mr. Fletcher's prospects? What was his family background? How much had he saved toward his school? The interrogation was thorough but not unkind, and Genevieve answered honestly, not attempting to inflate Mr. Fletcher's circumstances or connections. When she had heard everything, Lady Prudence sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. She revealed that she had her own fortune, inherited from her grandmother, and carefully invested over the years. Lord Prudence had left her well provided for, and she had no children of her own to inherit. She had been planning to leave everything to Genevieve eventually, but perhaps, she mused, there might be advantage in making some provision sooner rather than later. Before Genevieve could fully process this extraordinary statement, they were interrupted by urgent news from below stairs. Lord Thornbury's carriage had been spotted approaching Grosvenor Square a full day earlier than expected. The Marquis of Whitehall was with him. Panic ensued. Genevieve flew to her wardrobe, pulling out an appropriate afternoon gown, while Lady Prudence rang for Mary to help with her hair. They had perhaps 20 minutes to transform Genevieve from supposed servant back to lady of quality. Mary worked with frantic efficiency, her fingers flying as she arranged Genevieve's hair in an elaborate style suitable for receiving visitors. As they worked, Lady Prudence issued rapid instructions. Genevieve was to receive the Marquis with perfect propriety, giving no hint of what had transpired. They would need time to devise a strategy, to find some way to extricate her from the engagement without causing a scandal that would ruin them all. Until then, she must play her part. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as Genevieve, now properly dressed and coiffed, was descending the main staircase, Mr. Fletcher arrived for what he believed would be his final lesson. He had clearly spent the night in torment, for his face was haggard, his usual careful appearance somewhat disheveled. He looked up at the sound of footsteps on the stairs, expecting to see Mary, and instead found himself face to face with the vision of loveliness that was Miss Genevieve Thornbury in full aristocratic splendor. The recognition was instant and devastating. His green eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in understanding, then filled with such pain that Genevieve felt her heart might break. He took a step backward, his face paling, as the full scope of the deception became clear to him. At that exact moment, the front door opened, and Lord Thornbury entered with the Marquis of Whitehall. The four of them stood frozen in a tableau that would have been comical if it had not been so fraught with potential disaster. Lord Thornbury, a man of 50 with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, took in the scene with shrewd eyes. The Marquis, resplendent in a coat of bottle green superfine that matched his calculating eyes, looked between his intended bride and the obviously distressed tutor with growing suspicion. Lord Thornbury was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built his fortune through sharp observation and decisive action. He demanded to know what was occurring in his entrance hall, why his daughter appeared to be in some state of distress, and who precisely this young man was who stood staring at her with such obvious emotion. Harrington, appearing with his usual impeccable timing, introduced Mr. Fletcher as the tutor his lordship had engaged. This information did nothing to clarify the situation for Lord Thornbury, who pointed out quite reasonably that a tutor had no business looking at his daughter as if she had personally betrayed him. Mr. Fletcher, recovering some of his composure, bowed stiffly. He apologized for any impropriety, explaining that he had been surprised to see Miss Thornbury recovered from her illness. His voice, as he spoke these words, carried such bitter irony that even the obtuse Marquis detected something amiss. The Marquis stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand on Genevieve's arm. He expressed his delight at finding his intended bride in such obvious good health, though he noted she appeared somewhat pale. Perhaps, he suggested with heavy-handed gallantry, she might benefit from some air. He proposed a turn about the garden, where they could become better acquainted. It was at this moment that Lady Prudence made her entrance, descending the stairs with regal dignity, her cats trailing behind her. She surveyed the assembled company with the air of a general reviewing troops, then announced that there were matters requiring immediate discussion. She instructed Harrington to show the gentleman to the drawing room and to have tea sent up, saying that Genevieve would join them presently, after she had composed herself. Lord Thornbury began to protest, but his sister fixed him with a look that had quelled stronger men. She reminded him that Genevieve had been ill and required a moment to prepare herself for company. Surely the gentlemen could entertain themselves for a few minutes without female supervision. Reluctantly, Lord Thornbury and the Marquess allowed themselves to be led away. Mr. Fletcher moved to follow them, but Lady Prudence called him back. She informed him that his services would be required in the library, that there were matters regarding Miss Thornbury's education that needed immediate attention. Once the others were safely ensconced in the drawing room, Lady Prudence took charge with the efficiency of a military commander. She instructed Genevieve and Mr. Fletcher to follow her to the library, where they could speak without interruption. Once there, with the door firmly closed, she turned to face them both. She addressed Mr. Fletcher first, telling him that she knew everything. The deception, the feelings that had developed between him and her niece, the impossible situation they now found themselves in. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched at his sides, the obvious struggle between anger at being deceived and anguish at potentially losing what he had found. Then she did something extraordinary. She asked Mr. Fletcher what his intentions were toward her niece. The question was so unexpected, so contrary to every social convention, that both Genevieve and Mr. Fletcher stared at her in shock. She repeated the question, adding that she had not asked what he thought he should say, or what propriety dictated, but what his true intentions were. Mr. Fletcher looked at Genevieve then, really looked at her for the first time since discovering her identity. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. He said that his intentions, were the world different, would be entirely honorable. He would court her properly, win her father's approval, and offer her his hand in marriage. But the world was what it was, and he was a penniless tutor while she was engaged to a marquis. His intentions, therefore, were irrelevant. Lady Prudence turned to Genevieve and asked the same question. What were her intentions toward Mr. Fletcher? Genevieve, tears streaming down her face, said that she loved him, that she would choose him over every titled gentleman in England if she had the freedom to choose. But she did not have that freedom, and her intentions, like his, were meaningless in the face of reality. Lady Prudence regarded them both with something approaching exasperation. She informed them that they were both remarkably intelligent people who were being remarkably stupid. Every problem, she said, had a solution if one was willing to be creative enough to find it. She then laid out a plan so audacious that it took Genevieve's breath away. She would go to her brother and inform him of certain facts he might find interesting. First, that his daughter had compromised herself thoroughly by spending unchaperoned hours with the tutor while disguised as a servant. If this became known, no respectable man would marry her, including the Marquess. Second, that she, Lady Prudence, intended to settle a significant portion of her fortune on Genevieve immediately, making her financially independent. Third, that if Lord Thornbury attempted to force the marriage with the Marquess, she would ensure that every scandal sheet in London knew exactly what had transpired in his household. The alternative she would offer would be simple. Allow Genevieve to break her engagement with the Marquess, citing incompatibility or whatever excuse would satisfy society. After a suitable period, Mr. Fletcher, whose prospects would be significantly improved by the generous patronage of an anonymous benefactor, Lady Prudence herself, would be in a position to court Genevieve properly. It would cause talk, certainly, a merchant's daughter marrying a schoolmaster, but it would not be the ruinous scandal that the truth would create. Mr. A. Fletcher protested that he could not accept such charity, that his pride would not allow it. Lady Prudence fixed him with a steely gaze and asked whether his pride was more important than Genevieve's happiness. She was not offering charity, she said, but investment. She had investigated his plans for a school and found them sound. She would be a silent partner in the enterprise, providing capital in exchange for a share of future profits. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. Before either of them could fully respond to this proposition, Harrington appeared at the door, his face grave. Lord Thornbury was demanding his daughter's immediate presence in the drawing room. The Marquess was growing impatient and had begun to make unpleasant insinuations about the strange atmosphere in the household. Lady Prudence told Genevieve to go, to play her part a little longer while she spoke with her brother. As Genevieve moved to leave, Mr. Fletcher caught her hand. In front of Lady Prudence, propriety be damned, he raised it to his lips and kissed it gently. He told her that whatever happened, she should know that the hours they had spent together in this library had been the happiest of his life. She had shown him what true partnership of mind and spirit could be, and even if they could never be together, he would treasure the memory always. Genevieve wanted to stay, to pour out her heart to him, but Harrington was waiting. She squeezed Mr. Fletcher's hand once, trying to convey in that simple gesture all the love and hope and fear that filled her heart, then followed the butler to face her father and her supposed future husband. The drawing room, when she entered it, felt like a stage set for a play she no longer wished to perform in. Her father sat in his favorite chair, looking every inch the successful merchant who had clawed his way to respectability. The Marquis stood by the fireplace, posing in a way that displayed his figure to best advantage. Both men looked up as she entered, and she saw in their eyes not herself, but what she represented: a prize to be won, a connection to be exploited, a beautiful ornament to enhance their respective positions. The Marquis immediately launched into a prepared speech about their future together, about the improvements he planned for his estates, about the honor he was bestowing upon her family by this connection. He spoke of her beauty, comparing her to a fine piece of artwork he had recently acquired, and Genevieve realized with startling clarity that this was exactly how he saw her, as an acquisition, valuable and decorative, but ultimately just another possession to be displayed. Her father nodded approvingly at each point the Marquess made, occasionally interjecting comments about the settlement, about the advantages the match would bring to both families. Neither man asked her opinion or seemed to notice her growing distress. She was simply expected to sit quietly and look pleased while they discussed her future as if she were not present. It was into this scene that Lady Prudence entered, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had important news to deliver. She suggested that Lord Thornbury might wish to speak with her privately on a matter of some urgency. Her tone was such that even the self-absorbed Marquis recognized the gravity of the situation. Lord Thornbury, with visible reluctance, excused himself and followed his sister from the room. The Marquis, left alone with Genevieve, attempted to engage her in conversation, but she could barely focus on his words. Her thoughts were with Mr. Fletcher, wondering if she would ever see him again, if Lady Prudence's plan could possibly succeed, if she dared hope for a future different from the one that had been mapped out for her since birth. The minutes stretched interminably. The Marquis, perhaps sensing her distraction, became increasingly irritated. He made several pointed comments about the proper behavior expected of his future wife, about the importance of maintaining appropriate decorum, about his expectations for absolute propriety in all things. Each word felt like another bar being added to the cage that would imprison her. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was perhaps 20 minutes, Lord Thornbury returned. His face was thunderous, and he looked at his daughter with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been grudging respect. He addressed the Marquess formally, his voice controlled but tight. He regretted to inform him that the engagement would not be proceeding. Circumstances had arisen that made the match impossible. He offered no further explanation, though the Marquis demanded one with increasing vehemence. The Marquis turned to Genevieve, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He demanded to know what she had done, what scandal she had created that would cause her father to break such an advantageous engagement. When she remained silent, unable to speak through the combination of relief and fear that gripped her, he made several ugly accusations about her character, her virtue, her worthiness. A profound silence descended upon the room. The ornate clock upon the mantelpiece marked each second with deliberate precision, its tick-tock echoing like drumbeats in the charged atmosphere. Even the servants seemed to have stilled, as if the entire house held its breath. The Marquis's face, already flushed with indignation, deepened to an alarming shade of purple. It was Mr. Fletcher who answered him. He had entered the room quietly, and now stood beside Lady Prudence, who had positioned herself strategically near the doorway. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of steel as he suggested that the Marquis might wish to reconsider his words. No gentleman, he said, would speak so of a lady, particularly one who had done nothing more than recognize that they would not suit. The Marquis turned on him, his face purple with rage. He demanded to know what right a mere tutor had to speak in such a matter, what possible interest he could have in the situation. Mr. Fletcher stepped fully into the room, moving to stand beside Genevieve's chair. He said with perfect clarity that he had every right, as he intended to request permission to court Miss Thornbury himself, once a suitable period had passed. The explosion that followed was predictable. The Marquis raged about insults to his honor, about the presumption of servants who did not know their place, about the decline of proper society. Lord Thornbury stood silent, his face a mask, while Lady Prudence watched with the satisfaction of a chess player who had successfully executed a complex gambit. Finally, the Marquis stormed out, declaring that the Thornbury family would be ruined, that he would ensure they were cut by all respectable society. After he left, Lord Thornbury turned to his daughter and the young man standing protectively beside her. His voice was weary as he spoke. He said that his sister had explained everything, the deception, the feelings that had developed, the threat of scandal if he did not cooperate. He was not pleased, would never be pleased, that his carefully laid plans had been overturned. But as he looked at his daughter, he saw something familiar in her eyes, the same audacious spark that had driven him to risk everything in the Indies trade, the same refusal to accept limitations that had built his fortune from nothing. He was, above all, a practical man who recognized both defeat and opportunity when he saw them. He would not stand in their way, though he warned them that the path they had chosen would not be easy. He looked at Mr. Fletcher directly and said that if he was to court his daughter, it would be done properly, with all appropriate supervision and observation of propriety. Any hint of scandal beyond what would already attach to breaking the engagement with the Marquis, and he would ship Genevieve off to his estates in Ireland, where she would remain until she was 30. Mr. Fletcher bowed formally and said he would expect nothing less. He requested permission to call upon Miss Thornbury the following day, properly chaperoned, to begin a formal courtship. Lord Thornbury granted it with a curt nod, then left the room, his bearing that of a man who had fought a battle and lost. 6 months had passed since that tumultuous day in the Thornbury drawing room, and autumn had come again to London, painting the trees in Hyde Park in shades of gold and amber. The morning was crisp but bright as Genevieve stood in the small church of St. George's, Hanover Square, dressed not in the elaborate creation that had been ordered for her marriage to the Marquis, but in a simple gown of cream silk that she had chosen herself. The congregation was small, a deliberate choice. Lord Thornbury sat in the front pew, his expression still somewhat grim, but no longer actively disapproving. Beside him, Lady Prudence beamed with satisfaction, her cats having been left at home despite her protests that they should witness the triumph of her matchmaking. Mary was there too, in a new dress of blue wool, for she had remained in the Thornbury household despite the scandal, Genevieve having refused to let her suffer for her loyalty. Mr. Fletcher, for he would be Mr. Fletcher for only a few more minutes, stood at the altar, his face transformed by joy. He wore a new coat of excellent cloth, well maintained and carefully pressed, a gift from Lady Prudence, who had insisted that her investment in his school extended to ensuring he looked the part of a successful educator. His green eyes never left Genevieve as she walked toward him, and in them she saw reflected all the love, respect, and intellectual partnership she had dreamed of finding. The ceremony was simple, the words ancient and meaningful. When Mr. Fletcher, now her husband, kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made several of the ladies present reach for their handkerchiefs. Even Lord Thornbury, who had maintained his displeasure throughout the courtship, was seen to wipe something from his eye, though he would later claim it was merely a speck of dust. The wedding breakfast was held at Thornbury House, a modest affair by society standards, but perfect in its warmth and genuine happiness. Lady Prudence had arranged everything, ignoring Lord Thornbury's half-hearted protests about expense. She gave a toast that was both witty and touching, speaking of the courage required to choose love over convenience, authenticity over appearance, partnership over possession. As for the Tun's reaction to the match, it had been exactly as explosive as expected. The Marquis of Whitehall had indeed done his best to ensure the Thornbury family was socially ruined, but he had reckoned without Lady Prudence's extensive connections and sharp tongue. She had managed, through a combination of strategic gossip and carefully deployed information about the Marquis's own indiscretions, to transform the narrative from one of scandal to one of romance. The story that circulated through London's drawing rooms was of a love match so profound that it had overcome all obstacles, of a young woman brave enough to choose happiness over title, of a young man whose brilliance and integrity had won him the hand of an heiress despite his humble origins. It helped that Mr. Fletcher's school, established with Lady Prudence's backing in a charming property in Kent, had already begun to attract attention for its innovative methods and exceptional results. The gossips particularly enjoyed the detail, somehow leaked by an anonymous source, that Miss Thornbury had first fallen in love with Mr. Fletcher's mind during their literary discussions, that their courtship had been conducted through exchanges of poetry and philosophical debate. It was, everyone agreed, terribly romantic, even if rather eccentric. Some families, of course, cut the Thornburys entirely. But others, particularly those of the merchant class who had always felt themselves looked down upon by the ancient nobility, rallied to their support. And Lady Prudence, with her combination of aristocratic connections and complete indifference to public opinion, ensured that the newlyweds were received in enough respectable houses to maintain their place in society, albeit a rather different place than Lord Thornbury had originally envisioned. The school in Kent flourished beyond all expectations. Mr. Fletcher's innovative teaching methods, combined with Genevieve's organizational skills and Lady Prudence's business acumen, created an institution that would, in time, educate some of the finest minds of the next generation. Genevieve taught literature and languages, finding in the classroom the intellectual fulfillment she had always craved. She discovered she had a particular gift for reaching shy, bookish girls who reminded her of herself, showing them that their minds were as valuable as their faces, their thoughts as important as their accomplishments in needlework. Lord Thornbury, despite his initial resistance, eventually came to take pride in his son-in-law's achievements. He would never admit it publicly, but he had been heard to boast at his club about the revolutionary educational theories being developed at his daughter's school. He even, on occasion, recommended the establishment to business associates seeking quality education for their children. Mary, whose role in the deception had eventually become known to the household staff, had been offered a position as assistant teacher at the school. She had accepted with joy, having discovered during those strange days of impersonation that she had a yearning for education that had been suppressed by her circumstances. Under the Fletchers' tutelage, she blossomed into a formidable educator in her own right, eventually marrying the local vicar, a kind man who valued her intelligence and spirit. The Marquis of Whitehall, for his part, had married an earl's daughter with an impeccable pedigree and no opinions whatsoever. By all accounts, they were perfectly suited to each other, both being primarily interested in their own consequence and the preservation of ancient privileges. They produced the requisite heir and spare with dutiful efficiency and lived lives of such stupefying conventionality that even the most conservative members of the ton found them dull. On their first anniversary, Augustine, for Genevieve could now call him by his given name without impropriety, gave her a leather-bound volume of Wordsworth's poems, the same edition from which he had read during those magical days in the library when she had been Mary and he had been simply Mr. Fletcher. Inside, he had inscribed, "To my dearest Genevieve, who taught me that the greatest education is learning to see with the heart as well as the mind. Forever your devoted student and teacher, A." She gave him, in return, a portrait she had commissioned of the two of them in the library at Thornbury House, surrounded by books, caught in one of their animated discussions. The artist had captured perfectly the way they leaned toward each other, the meeting of minds as much as hearts that characterized their union. It would hang in the main hall of their school for generations, inspiring countless students with the simple truth it portrayed, that love and learning, properly combined, could overcome any obstacle society might erect. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. Sometimes it requires deception to reveal truth, servants' clothes to uncover nobility of spirit, and the courage to choose happiness over the approval of the world. But for those brave enough to reach for it, love offers rewards that no title or fortune could ever match: the joy of a true partnership, the comfort of being known and valued for one's authentic self, and the satisfaction of building a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The Tun would continue to gossip about the unusual match for years to come, but Genevieve and Augustine paid them no mind. They were too busy living the life they had chosen together, educating young minds, raising their own children to value character over status, and proving daily that the best marriages are those built on friendship, respect, and shared purpose. Lady Prudence lived to see her great-nieces and nephews grow up in a household where intelligence was celebrated regardless of gender, where questions were encouraged, and where love was shown through both word and deed. She would often visit the school, holding court in the garden while her cats, with the dignity peculiar to their species, pursued, without notable success, the local population of sparrows, dispensing wisdom and sharp observations to anyone willing to listen. She would sometimes tell the older students, those on the verge of entering society themselves, the story of how their headmaster and headmistress had met and married. The young listeners, some with eyes full of dreams, others bearing the uncertainty of their own futures, would attend to Lady Prudence's words with that particular attention that only truth, disguised as fiction, can command. She always ended the tale with the same words: "Remember, my dears, that society will always try to tell you who you should be, whom you should love, what you should value. But true happiness comes from having the courage to decide these things for yourself. And if that requires a bit of creative deception along the way, well, sometimes the greatest truths can only be revealed through the most elaborate fictions." Years later, when Genevieve's own daughter faced pressure to make a brilliant match, she would remember her mother's story and choose her own path, marrying a brilliant botanist whose passion for plants matched her own love of natural philosophy. The tradition of choosing love over convention, authenticity over appearance, would bloom through generations, not as a lasting legacy etched in stone, but as a living inheritance of courage that would flourish in each new heart brave enough to claim it. For Genevieve's true fortune lay not in the Thornbury name or estate, but in having planted seeds of audacity that would flower in her descendants, proof eternal that love, when genuine and freely chosen, remains the greatest treasure any family can possess. In the annals of London society, there would be more scandalous stories, more dramatic elopements, more shocking revelations. But few would match the perfect satisfaction of a tale where everyone, save perhaps the Marquis of Whitehall, received exactly what they deserved. The lovers found each other. The loyal were rewarded, the wise were vindicated, and the pompous were deflated. It was, Lady Ravenswood must confess with considerable satisfaction, one of the finest examples of Providence's excellent judgment in matters of the heart. And if, dear listeners, you should find yourself faced with a choice between a brilliant match that satisfies everyone but yourself and a humble connection that makes your heart sing, remember the courage of Genevieve Thornbury, who risked everything for love and won more than she ever imagined possible. For in the end, the greatest risk is not in defying society's expectations, but in accepting a life that is less than what your heart knows you deserve. This author, your faithful Lady Ravenswood, takes her leave now with the deepest satisfaction of having shared a tale where true worth triumphed over mere position, where courage conquered convention, and where love, that most rebellious of emotions, refused to bow to the dictates of society. May we all possess such audacity when our moment of choice arrives.